There we go. All right. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Baker. I'm the Director of Education here for TIA. I'm joined by our Chief Economist, Noël Perry. We'll be talking about inflation comes to trucking during our Lunch and Learn webinar today. If you've joined us before, we always have a little bit of housekeeping to go through. So Noël, if you can go to the next slide, we'll run through the antitrust statement. So discussion, comments, and presentations during TIA functions must not, one, refer to any past, present, or future rates, prices, or anything related thereto. Two, include any reference to marketing strategies. Three, include any discussion of boycotts of any person, product, or firm. Or four, inhibit any members' employees from discussing employment with other member companies. Go to the next slide for me, Noël. A little bit of Zoom housekeeping before we jump right into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about today. If you have questions for Noël during the session, you can submit those in two different ways. You can submit them through the Q&A button in your Zoom control panel, or you can submit them through the chat. We will collect them throughout his presentation, and then I will facilitate that Q&A at the end of the session. We'll probably have 10 or 15 minutes for open Q&A. We will be recording this session, so within 24 to 36 hours, you'll have access to this recording through the member resource library at tianet.org. With that, Noël, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. I hope you're having a safe day. It's beautiful here in Pennsylvania. Maybe spring is finally here. Now, I'm going to talk about a particular aspect of the trucking economy today, and that meaning costs. And the reason why I am doing it is that there has been a change starting roughly in the year 2000. And for most of my career, my excessively long career, the price of trucking in real terms was falling. And even in absolute terms, it got cheaper every year. Well, starting around the year 2000, that changed. And you can see here, truck prices, this is a blend of both spot and contract. It's an average price. Obviously, any given lane is quite different than this. But the average shows that it's going up, steadily up. And if you look carefully at the right side of this graph, you can see that it's going up a little more steeply right now. So what I thought I'd do would be talk about this, explain where it's coming from, and talk about what the implications might be for those of us who inhabit this industry. So here's the history, and you can see this dotted line is the rough trend since the year 2003. And even a Dallas Cowboy fan can see that that line is going up. Now, the two big issues right now, and I'll talk about the other ones as well, the two big issues are fuel and driver wage. And there's a big difference between these two, and it illustrates what's happening right now. And it explains the several aspects of what's happening right now. The blue there is fuel, and you can see that it's been going up pretty rapidly. It peaked about 2 weeks ago, maybe even a week ago. And right now it's going down because people are beginning to be a little bit less worried about the Ukrainian war. But what I want to emphasize about fuel is that fuel is a variable thing. It goes up and down. Let me back up here and show you what that means. Notice that there is a trend line here, the one that's going up, and sometimes the line is way above it, and sometimes it's below it. And what we know is that fuel goes up and down. It's not a permanent increase sometimes, it's a partial increase. And I'll show you the statistics later that prove this. So for instance, there in 2008, you can see the blue line is way above that dotted line. And if we looked at the fuel numbers, and we will later, it was way above. Then it came down. The same thing happened somewhat in the early teens, happened in 18, and then has happened again today. So some of these things go up and down, go up and then come down and give you relief. And fuel's an example of that. Let's go this way. Driver wage has some cyclicality. There was a big increase in driver wage in 04, 05, 06, and some of that was given back during the Great Recession. However, it's my strong belief that the changes we've had in the last 4 or 5 years are permanent. And so, and you can see that driver wage is way more important in terms of what is increasing prices for us in this business, up to the point where it's a lot right now. So we'll talk about driver wage. Well, let's talk about driver wages a little bit more. Used to be a starting driver, over the road driver, guy slept in a truck, would start somewhere between 40 and 45,000. And that prevailed through about 2016. It was up a little bit more over what it had been in the year 2000, but that was the kind of rule of thumb. Since then, driver wages have increased by more than 50%, and the guys are making somewhere in the neighborhood of 70,000 a year. We've talked forever about driver shortages, and I'm going to say something quite flat here, and I'll say it in two ways. First off, if there was a real driver shortage, it would be a shortage of trucks, and some of the freight wouldn't move. And as tight as the market is, the freight moves. So that means that somehow we're finding enough drivers. It's just hard to find them. Now, the other way to put it is, there may well be a shortage, and I understand it completely, of people who are willing to sleep in a truck for $45,000 a year. If we almost double that to 70 or 80,000, there's not nearly as much of a shortage. And let me be frank about this. If you're a high school grad with no college and no particular skills, or maybe even not even a high school grad, where else can you make $70,000 a year plus benefits? I don't know, unless it's some government job. So from a wage standpoint, a $70,000 a year, $75,000 a year job is pretty attractive. The railroad business where I used to work has also very difficult working conditions. They've been paying a lot more for a long time, and they never have shortages of workers. Despite the fact, well, for instance, my brother, who was a conductor on the railroad, several times worked 8 12s in a week. Think about that. The guy's never home. But he was making $80,000 a year that year, so he was satisfied. So one of the most important element of inflation, if you might call it that, in truck driving is the driver wage. And given how hard the work is and how often they are away from home and how often they have to sleep in a truck, you can understand why it takes $70,000 a year to employ somebody permanently in a truck. Let's go on. Okay, everything else is going up too. Here's a list of the number of things that contribute to truck costs. Capital is the cost of the truck, and it's going up because trucks are getting more complicated. Maintenance has been up because they're doing a lot of maintenance right now because of the hard work on the trucks. And then there's insurance and tires and permits and those things. I want to talk about two of these just for a moment to show how this pressure will continue as we go into farther into the 20s. Insurance is a big deal because with liability awards in trucking are beginning to go up dramatically. Used to be that the average trucker had $1 million of insurance, or maybe even less, and that was all that the plaintiff lawyers would go for because they figured they couldn't get any more. Nowadays, it's going up into multi-millions, and it's spreading. So almost everybody figures that insurance costs are going to go up. The other one I want to emphasize is tolls, and that's just a placeholder here for taxes. The federal government is running this huge deficit and expanding and still expanding spending rapidly. How are we going to pay for that? Well, there is an example for us that tells us something, and that is in Europe, where they have a bigger social net than we have here, where they have huge deficits. They fund a lot of the benefits that they give to their populace, people, things like full health care for everybody. They fund it through taxes on fuel, transportation taxes, because they understand how important transportation is, both personal and commercial, to everybody in their countries, and people will continue to pay even though it's more expensive. Pennsylvania, for instance, now has the highest or second highest road taxes in the country, and nobody's complaining because they're using some of that money anyway to fix the roads. So it's quite likely that taxes on trucking will increase dramatically over the next 10 years, probably to the point where there will be a GPS monitor in every truck that measures the number of miles the truck moves, and each mile there'll be a charge. If we look at England right now, for instance, the UK, their equivalent tax per gallon of diesel fuel is like $3. In the States, it's like 35 or 40 cents. So 10 times. That's an exposure. The point here is all of us in this business have got to get used to the fact that there's a higher cost base than there used to be. Now, here's one of the ways to look at it. What I've shown here is spot pricing, the actual spot pricing compared to the trend. And if you look at this picture and go from the left side, starts in 1993 and goes up to about 2016, the line is straight. And that means that there was a nice consistent underlying trend in costs and pricing. And so the actual pricing went up and down, above and below this, depending on market conditions. Notice, however, in 2017, 2018, and then again in 2021, 2022, the line jumps up. And that's because there's a permanent underlying increase in costs. In the case of 2018, it has something to do in part with productivity and also labor costs. This time it is much more so in terms of labor cost and other aspects of the business. These are permanent cost changes, not like fuel that goes up and down, but things that stay with us. So cost has been going up at about 1.9% a year if we look across this whole time. Starting through the rest of the 2020s, they will continue to follow that same path, 1.9% a year, but from a higher base because we've had this permanent uptick. And you can see it's worth what, maybe 25 cents a mile. That's not going away. Now, let's talk a little bit about oil, the one that goes up and down. And you can see on the top line, this is the information from the federal government. Cushing, Oklahoma, okay, WTI is the generally accepted standard price for crude sold in the United States. Turns out that there's a big market. Well, Cushing, Oklahoma is where a lot of the crude is stored prior to being sent to refineries. And so the price of the crude coming out of there is generally accepted as the standard price for crude produced in the United States. You've probably heard the term Brent crude. That's a place in the North Sea, England, I believe, or maybe it's Norway. At any rate, that's the price for crude elsewhere in the world, usually slightly higher than the US price. But either one show the same pattern we have here. And that is for many years, the 80s, 90s, and up until about 2000, price of oil stayed in what? It was around 25 bucks a barrel. Then it started to go steadily between 2000 and 2008. And the reason for this wasn't OPEC. It was because the undeveloped world was developing rapidly and increasing the demand for fuel more rapidly than the ability to produce it was happening. And there was a big uptick in economics in 06, 07, and that put even more pressure. And of course, it peaked, you probably remember, at about 150 bucks a barrel. And then it collapsed suddenly because when you have a downturn like we had in the Great Recession in 08, 09, that people use less oil. And this is the market. And if people use less, the price goes down. Then it went back up again and kind of stabilized in the $100 range, $100 a barrel range between 2010 and 2015. And then suddenly something changed. And what changed is the invention of fracked oil. This new technology that enabled people to drill deeper and more cheaply and get more out of the ground by pumping stuff down in the ground that fractured the iron, I mean, not the iron, the stone way down there, and letting the oil escape and collected in the pipes and brought back up. This is what's happened in the Bakken up there in North Dakota. It's happened a lot in Texas. And from a natural gas standpoint, it's happening in the Marcellus Shale, which runs basically from Ohio across northern Pennsylvania. New technology dramatically increased the production of oil from the United States, and suddenly there was enough oil in the world, and the price fell. And so the U.S. now is the #1 producer of oil, and we are the swing producer that keeps the price from going crazy, at least most of the time. So one of the things we keep track of now, we have an easy way to measure the pressure of price or of demand on supply, therefore to create a price. And we look at the number of rigs that are drilling in the United States. And the picture you have there in the bottom shows the number of rigs that is published every day or every week by Baker Hughes. If you just type in Baker Hughes rig count, you'll see these pictures. And you can see that in 19, we had a lot of drilling, and then 18, 17, and 16, we had even more. It was in the thousands of rigs. However, with the price low there at what, $50 a barrel, it wasn't worth the money to do a lot of drilling. So they stopped, and you can see the number of rigs dropped in was dropping. And of course, when we did the shutdowns of everything in early 2020, it went to a disastrously low level. What this did was to reduce the supply of American oil in the marketplace, and the price went up. You can see, by the way, that the US market is responding. The number of rigs is going up again. And what that says is eventually we're going to catch up to the demand and drag the price down. Of course, in the short term, we have these worries about Russian oil affected by the embargoes, the sanctions that the developed world is putting against Russia because of their invasion of the Ukraine. What that does is take oil off the marketplace, and the traders were really afraid that they wouldn't be able to get enough oil, and they bid the price up to what, 130 bucks a barrel. The last week, it's come back down to somewhere around 100 or slightly less, because the traders figure that there's going to be a settlement soon in Ukraine, and people will say, okay, I'll buy Russian oil again. So this is what's happening with oil. It's been up. and it's going to come down again. So this piece of it will be okay after a few years. And you can see the history. Each time it went up after the year 2000, it went right back down again because eventually the market responded. Now let's look at general inflation. This is the thing that worries me more than anything else. It worries me even more than Vladimir Putin. As an Austrian economist, I believe very strongly, like Milton Friedman and a whole bunch of other people, that if you expand the money supply like crazy, like the Federal Reserve has been doing for the last 25 years, you eventually lose control of the value of the dollar, and people begin bidding it up because there's just a lot more dollars compared to the demand for goods that the dollars buy. You increase the money supply and the value of the money goes down. And for a long time, that has not happened. And it's puzzled people because we have been increasing the money supply for a long time, and the value didn't go up, in part, well, heavily because of the globalization of manufacturing has introduced a whole new tranche of low wage workers. And so they kept inflation at bay because the people in South Vietnam or in Thailand or in China were willing to work for so much less. Well, now that those economies are developed, that those labor costs are beginning to go up. And so that cap on inflation that was created by global competition is much weaker. Not to mention the fact that because of the COVID mess, we've realized that being dependent on sources of goods 16,000 miles away makes us vulnerable. And so those sources are a lot less important. So the cap's off, and now people are beginning to think, wait a minute, we got all this money flowing at us. Is inflation going to happen? And it got kicked up a little bit by oil and some other things back in early 2021, and by that very strong demand for goods. And then it gains a momentum of its own. And this is the thing that economists don't understand very well, is how that momentum starts and what it takes to stop it. And well, we know what it takes to stop it. And here's the important point. We want to stop it because inflation is inherently damaging. You want to live in Argentina? They have inflation all the time and their economy is a mess. You want to live in Weimar, Germany in the 20s when you had to take a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread? It gets out of control. And so the only way to control it is to raise interest rates, which is what Volcker did back in 1982 when US inflation was 16%, twice what it is today, and slow the economy down, force a recession to make people compete harder and to reduce the money supply. So this is a very, very dangerous thing for the US economy. And let me put it in different terms, and I think I've got it on the next slide. Do I? Yes, I do. No, I don't. The US economy is dependent on very low interest rates, 2-3%, or a mortgage rate until quite recently was 2.8 or 3.5. And the federal government is borrowing money for this tremendous deficit we have at very low interest rates. A lot of these things depend on interest rates being between 0 and 3%. What are you making on your savings account in the bank? Half a quarter of percent? I just filed my income taxes and I put down my interest income for the year. It was 12 cents. If we go back to interest rates of 5 to 7%, which is the average over time, this whole house of cards we've had falls apart and we go into recession. So inflation is a very big deal for the economy. Now, for trucking, it's also very important because in an inflating market, you have to keep you got to keep raising rates to to balance off the fact that your costs are going up. Or if you're a shipper, you have to understand that your suppliers are going to be raising their rates constantly because their costs are going up. And it's a much more complex and more difficult to manage world than the one we've had recently, which is saying, don't worry about inflation. Now you have to. What are the effects? Well, I've got two here. I'm comparing inflation to fuel, and I'm talking about inflation outside of the cost of fuel. And you can see that if we have a $2.76 load, kind of an average load, it's not any particular load, it's just an average for the whole industry. Fuel is adding about what? We see 22 cents to that since 2021. But inflation is averaging 24 cents more. So it's something we really have to be aware of and putting in pricing so we can continue to give the good service that customers need. And from a shipper standpoint, unfortunately, you're going to have to pay more to get the kind of service that's essential for getting your goods to market. Now, what does this mean about a price forecast going farther? Now, the red line is the actual price of spot, and you can see it's way above normal. And what we know from history is when it gets way above normal, it comes back down. It comes back down to normal. So the most likely case here is that prices are going to fall dramatically over the next couple of years. And if they go back to normal, that's the blue line that I've talked about before, there'll be a very substantial, more than 25% reduction. However, that reduction would be more than 25%, a lot more, were it not for the fact that of that change from what used to be $2.60 to at one point $4 a mile, 15% of that, a 15% reduction over history is inflation. It's the permanent increase, trucking inflation of the costs that we have to pay in order to provide the service that the great truckers in this country do. So yeah, there's going to be a major reduction in prices over the next year and a half. Exactly when, I don't know. Exactly how fast, I don't know. What I do know is it's going to occur sooner than most people expect and then go faster than most people expect. Can't be more specific than that. However, it's not going to go all the way back to down to where we used to be because we're paying the drivers $70,000 a year now, not 45. So, time for questions, and I'll hand the mic back to the boss out there in Lake Tahoe.
All right. Thank you, Noel, for all that information. We appreciate it. So just a reminder, everybody, if you have questions for Noel, you can throw those into the chat or use the Q&A button. Well, we have one question here. It says, how do you determine the spot price pre-fuel trend? It looks mostly like a straight line, but there are a couple of jumps in there.
Oh, yeah. The trend is just an arithmetic compound growth calculation. You take the actual data and you use Excel to put a trend on it. So it's just the average price included in all those jumps up and down. The jumps up and down are when it increased temporarily more than the average, and then it eventually comes back down. The jumps are the increase in underlying cost that I have been talking about. That you have to calculate outside and apply it to the long-term trend. You could simply calculate the trend, including the increases over the last few years, but you wouldn't be able to isolate how much they were. And so I take the average from 1993 until 2016, when the market was relatively orderly, and then I have imposed upon that the step function increase I've been talking about here. Next question.
So Noel, it looks like we don't have any questions, but we might have a few coming in over the next minute.
Okay.
Here's another one. This
All
is
right.
from Hayden. This is from Hayden. I got one just now. So
Okay.
I don't understand how on Monday at the QT, diesel was $4.50 per gallon, and then hourly to into the next day, it goes up to $5.19 per gallon. That diesel has been sitting in their tanks from a delivery probably a week ago before fuel shut up. And that fuel that they got delivered, I'm guessing, was refined. What, a month or two ago when oil was much lower? So how does 2.5-month-old fuel from oil to refinement go from $3.89 to $5.19 a gallon in a week?
Okay, this will take a minute, and when we're done with this question, I want to add. Well, when we're done with all the questions, I've got a demand update to provide as well. But let's talk about how markets work. Markets work based on what people think is happening right now, and how hard up they are to either sell their fuel or to buy fuel. And the price of fuel on Monday was that $5 diesel fuel is the result of a bunch of buyers who think that because of the Russian problems, they're not going to be able to get enough fuel. And so they say, I'll pay more to make sure I have the fuel. It's not determined at all by the cost in the short term. It's not determined at all by the cost of the refining. And so what happens when the marketplace goes up and down, and I'll show both sides of this, is when the market is going up like it is today, the people that sell get a windfall because they produce that fuel, just as this questioner said, a month ago, based on $80 a barrel oil. But the price today reflects more $100 barrel oil. So they're making a nice little profit. But it works the other way too, because the price of oil is going to fall probably if this Ukrainian mess is settled, and it looks like it might in the next week or two. Then it's going to fall. And let's just take the situation a month from now. A month from now, let's say the price is back down to $70 a barrel, or maybe even lower, because things tend to overshoot. So that's what the price of diesel fuel may be back to $4 or $3.80. However, the producer that gets that price was using $100 oil a month ago to make that fuel. So they get murdered by the lags between pricing and cost, between the price of the final good and the price of the ingredients when the prices are falling. So over time, it averages out. When the price is going up, the producers make a lot of money. When the price goes down, the consumer makes a lot of money. So here's the way to think of it. Right now, the truckers are pissed off, and I understand why. In a month or two, when the price comes down, they're going to be happy. And the refiners are going to be pissed off. That's the way markets work. They're not, in the short term anyway, determined by the cost it takes to make the product. They are determined by how much of that product's available and how bad people want it. Now, in the long term, the cost of the good compared to the price determines how much is available. But in the short term, it's not that way. And like I said, sometimes we as consumers get screwed. Sometimes we get a big benefit, and the producer gets screwed because of the lags in the marketplace. The alternative is to have the government set the price, and we know the government's not very good at anything having to do with economics. Now, next question.
Let's see. So it says, you said that spot prices are going to come down faster and sooner than most people think. Is that just because you think oil prices are going to come down? Why would oil prices have an effect on the spot price, excluding fuel, especially if wages are still going up?
Okay, wages are going up, but they're not going to continue to go up. You don't have to pay a guy $100,000 a year to drive a truck. You pay him $70,000. what we have is a one-time increase. Now, and however, if we look at what's happened, well, I just showed it here. I'm going to go back a couple of slides here. Right here. This is what's happened to the spot price. It's up like the total of since, what that arrow is, since 16, it's up 35, 40, it's up 40%. Well, 2/3, the 25% compared to the 15 is just supply and demand. It's people were so hard up have been so hard up for capacity that they bid the price up way above the costs. And so truckers are making a lot of money right now, and so are brokers. And the shippers are complaining, although they are getting their goods to marketplace. Now, and this is what I was going to talk about anyway, when the demand for trucking comes back towards normal, and the demand for trucking has been way above normal recently, but as it comes back, people aren't going to be near as hard up. They're going to bid those prices back down like they always do. That's what history says. Price goes up, price goes down. When they bid it down, it's not going to go as far as we thought because of those increases. However, let me repeat this point. 2/3 or more of the price increase we've had over the last couple of years have had to do with people being exceptionally hard up to find capacity. It's not a cost issue, it's a scarcity issue. Now, we also know that over the past year, people have been hiring drivers like crazy. They're paying them more, they're getting them. And we also know, and here's what I wanted to add, it looks like this boom in the demand for trucking is about to level off and go down. If you look at the truckstop.com numbers for the last couple of weeks, their MDI indicator, it's going down pretty rapidly. So what that says is that sometime over the next 2 years, we're going to get back to normal in terms of prices, which is the blue line here, not which is around $3 a mile for this fictitious average rather than $4. I say that it always happens faster than expected. It'll probably happen more slowly than I expected because I'm an expert on these cycles. Most everybody else just figures that whatever happened last week is going to continue to happen. And for the last 2 years, truckers have really been fortunate. Brokers too. And they've gotten used to these extraordinary market conditions. Well, when the market changes, they're not going to be ready because they're assuming that it's going to go on forever. Well, it don't. And so what I'm saying is whether it happens in 2022, which I think is about 60% probable for spot prices, or whether it happens in 2023, which I think is the rest of the probability, it's going to surprise people because people just don't look ahead, they only look backwards. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have a question from Melody. This looks like a follow-up. So she says, then how do we deal with trucks that are accepting these rates? They aren't so willing to decrease their rates.
Repeat the question, please.
I'll do my best. So she said, then how do we deal with trucks that are accepting these rates but aren't so willing to decrease their rates?
Oh, the marketplace. If demand goes down, the most expensive trucks won't get the loads. And, it's either lower your price or be empty. That's how markets work. People don't want to change, and they may hang out there hoping that the market won't change, but eventually it will, whether it's the going up part or the coming down part. And the people that are ready for these changes are the guys and the women who are successful because they say, okay, we've had 2 good years, but I know they're not going to last. I want to make sure I can survive in a market with lower price. I'm going to be ready, and I'm going to keep my relationships with my best customers. So if there's a recession, and I think there's a chance of recession over the next 2 years, I'm going to be the trucker who gets the loads. Even though they're at a lower price, I'm still going to get the loads. That's how markets work. Next question.
So Noel, it looks like that's all we have for right now.
Okay. Well, let me close with two important things to remember. First off, the whole purpose of this particular discussion was to point out that trucking costs have gone up in a permanent way. We're looking at this spot market picture I have right here. They haven't gone up to $4 a mile, but they've gone up to $3 a mile, and that ain't going to change. And so if you're a shipper and you look at your budgets, your 2023 budget, when the market comes back to normal, is going to be a lot lower than it was this year, but it's not going to be back to where it was in 2016 before all this excitement started. And that's because, well, the biggest reason is because we haven't made enough babies in this economy. We haven't allowed people to come in from outside, immigration wise, and a bunch of old folks like me are retiring. Hell, a year from now, I'm going to be playing golf rather than talking on the computer. And what that means is there's a shortage of labor in this country, and it just takes more money to persuade a man or a woman to sleep in a truck. So that's the first thing. Costs are up maybe 15% over the last 4 years, and that's permanent. The other thing is that we are either at or rapidly approaching an inflection point. And when an economist says inflection point, what he or she is really saying is things are going to change, boy, so wake up. And that is this uptick, this wonderful conditions for trucking anyway, we've had over the last 2 years are about to change. We don't know how fast they're going to change yet. Maybe it won't be for another year and a half or so before we're back to normal, but they are changing. And so it's time for people to begin thinking about how they go back to working under normal conditions rather than working under the extraordinary conditions we've had over the past 2 years. You know, waves go up and they come down. And right now that wave is about to crest and start coming down. So it's time to begin thinking about how you go back to your normal business practice. So that's what I have for this week. Perhaps in a month or so, I'll talk a lot more about that inflection point. But for the time being, I hope you have a safe week and enjoy the spring that's coming at us.
Yeah.
Thanks for your attention.
Yeah. Thanks, Noel. Can you go ahead a couple of slides for me? I just want to wrap up for us here.
Be glad to.
Thank you again to everybody for joining us today and for your questions. I know Noel and I really appreciate it. When you close out of Zoom today, you'll be prompted to take a post-webinar survey for us. If you can do that and fill that out, that'll help us know what topics you're interested in learning more about in the future, and we can get those scheduled for you probably sometime after conference. And then make sure that you make some time to join us next week on the same day at the same time. We're going to be joined by our friends at Lean Solutions Group, and they're going to be talking about Nothing Has Changed, how labor markets continue to sputter. So it should be a good conversation. We hope to see all of you back with us next week. And on that, I will echo Noel. Everybody have a safe rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Be safe.